Hi everyone, I thought today we would take a deeper look at identifying our stitches and parts of those stitches. So I've already done a video about identifying parts of your stitch, but I've had a few deeper questions from some of our subscribers on the stitches, how to find them, the parts of them, what's the top, what's the bottom. So I thought I'd go over this a little bit more in depth in another video. So as you can see, I've done a set of chains here. So I've done a chain of 10. So basically, when you've got chain stitches, you will have these V formations on the front of your work. Okay, so if I pull it apart a little bit like that, you can see that it's creating a V. Each of these V's is a stitch. This is known as a chain stitch. So this is the front of your work. If we turn to the back, you're going to see these little bumps here. And there are projects where you will be asked to work into the back bumps of your chains. So that's what these are. So this is the back of your work. Hopefully you can see that with the lighting here. Okay. And so if I show you this side, see how there's little bumps sticking up? So those are the back bumps. If I turn it back over to face the front, see it sits much flatter. So if I show you the side profile there, so you can see the bumps are on the bottom and it's flat on the top. So the bumps are the back of your work, and the flat V's are the front of your work. So when we're counting stitches, for example, if I'm counting the number of chains I've got on hand, and I'm just going to grab my needle here just to help out, I'm going to count each of these little bumps here, okay, or the edges of the V. So the V formation is right there. And these are the bumps on the side. So if I never count the loop, the open loop, or the loop that would be on your hook, which would be this one. So we always count from the bottom of that loop. So this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. Now you want to be careful that you don't count the slip knot. That is not a stitch. See how it snugs in tightly? So this would be your 10th stitch, or your first one if you're counting from here on up. So that is how we count the number of chain stitches. So let's talk about parts of the stitch, what sits next to what and on top of what. So I'm just using the double crochet stitch as an example because it sits a little bit taller and I feel it'll make it a little bit easier for this example. So if I began my project here with a foundation chain row of 10, so a lot of projects will start with a chain row unless you're working in the round. So this is my foundation chain row. Now if I want to do a double crochet stitch or a row of double crochet stitches, we need to get up to the height of that stitch in order to work across the way so that your work will look even. So generally speaking, the height of a double crochet stitch is comparable to 3 chains, okay? So you would see people do 1, 2, and 3. Okay, some people are happy with using just 2 chains for the height of your work, okay, but I like to use 3. So that brings the height of my work up to here. So the set of 3, okay, now this chain right here is the base, what would be considered the base of this stitch. So the base would be the bottom of your stitch. Okay, so in this case, because we only have a chain of 3, it's hard to sometimes understand because we haven't actually delved into the double crochet stitch yet. So this is 3 chains, which represents the height of a double crochet stitch, and will also count as a double crochet stitch in our row here. Okay, so usually what they'll tell you is that the 4th chain from the hook. So remember, this big loop was on the hook. We count 1, 2, 3, because remember 3 is the height, represents a double crochet stitch. I know I'm repeating myself, but I just want to make sure I drive home this point. The 4th chain is now the beginning of your next stitch. So this is where we're going to create our double crochet. Okay. And so we insert our hook here. And we create the double crochet stitch. So now we've created the height of a double crochet stitch. So some people will use the chain of 2. I like the 3. The base is the bottom of that stitch where it sits on. So that chain here, which would be the 4th chain, and this is the bottom row. This is where sometimes it can get a little confusing. And once we work through this row, I hope that it will clarify things. So I did a chain of 10, then I chained another 3 so that I can bend my work, so to speak, and now start to create the row. So because 3 chains represents the height of a double crochet, the 4th chain here, this is the base, also known as the bottom of that stitch. This is where the stitch sits on top of. So into this 5th chain, I am now going to work my double crochet stitch, the actual stitch. So I'll yarn over, I'll insert into that 5th hook here, and I'll explain why in a second. And I'm going to resolve the double crochet stitch. Okay, so now what happens is, so it's bending around the way there, and so some people get a little bit nervous, but as we do more rows, this will straighten out. So if I come back to the top, see this 1, 2, and 3, that represents the height of a double crochet, and this 4th stitch here is actually the bottom, the base, you see, of that chain. So all of these chains will be the base of all of our stitches. So if this chain here is the base of this chain 3, the very next stitch beside it, which means that next V loop, which is here, this chain is the base of this double crochet. So remember, these are all the V stitches sitting on the side. So anytime you hear someone discussing the base, that represents the base of this stitch, it's the stitch within which the stitch is being worked into. Wow, that is a mouthful. So you know what I'm going to do? Let's do a couple more double crochets, and hopefully this will make a bit more sense. So let's do some more double crochets because we're working basically our foundation row in this little swatch here. So we're using the double crochet stitch. I go into the very next stitch beside the one that I've just worked. And how do I know what I've just worked? You just pull your work apart, and if you can see how this loop is pulling here? That double crochet has been worked into that stitch. So that means the very next one beside it, which is this one here, that's the next one I work into. Okay, so pull through. I'm just pulling through 2 loops and 2 again. So that's my double crochet stitch. Okay, so hopefully you can start seeing now as I pull this apart a little bit. Each of the loops that has yarn worked through it, those are the worked stitches. The stitch beside this one is this one right here. So that's what we're going to work into next to do the next double crochet. So see, just pull your work apart and you can see this one's been worked. This is our next stitch right beside it. So I'm right-handed. So when I'm talking about the very next stitch next to this, it's always the one to the left of the one I've just worked. Okay, so I've just worked this stitch. The very next opening is right there. Okay, so yarn over, insert, pull through, yarn over, and pull through. So there you go. So you've got a couple more I'm just going to do a few more here too. So the very next stitch is right there. Insert, pull through, and very next stitch. See, I pull that apart. Very next stitch is this V right here. Okay, so your work is looking something like this. So you can see all the stitches are sitting nicely on top of each base chain stitch. So if I pull that apart like that, hopefully you can see that. Now I've got one more, and this is another common occurrence that happens when we get to the end of a row. In this case, it's the end of the chain. So I have one more chain stitch here, and then I have the slip knot. We do not work into the slip knot. That's meant to secure things there. If you're ever unsure, what you do is you count backward, okay? So I know that I wanted 10 stitches across. So right now, I'm gonna count my double crochet stitches. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Remember that chain 3 counts as 1. 9 stitches, I know I want 10, so I should have room only for one more, and in fact I do, and it's this one right here. So I will do a double crochet into this last chain stitch here. Okay, and this would apply whether you're using half double crochets or single crochets. I just felt that using the double crochet stitch would just make things a little bit clearer. It's just a bit taller. So you see these little ridges here along the bottom, that's the chain, the foundation chain that we did at the beginning, which I did 10. Then I chained an additional 3 to come up and around to work our way back. Then what I did is I didn't work into the fourth one, because remember, this fourth one is actually the base or your 10th foundation chain. Okay, so the additional 3 is part of the next row because we bend it upward and start working across the other way. I hope that that's making sense there. Make sure to leave me a comment if anything is a bit convoluted. I am more than happy to answer your questions. And I really want to make sure that this makes sense, because once you understand these basic concepts, it really opens up the whole world of crocheting to you, and you'll see just how easy it is to grasp more intricate stitches once you get the basic idea of how the functionality of the stitches and the stitch count works. Okay, so we've got, so just if I turn over, you can see the back there. So we've got chain stitches, which are usually the base of our work. We've got chains that turn our work or create the bend of a stitch so that we can basically turn our work. So that's why a lot of times they call it turning, or if you need 2 extra base stitches to flank a piece of work on. So we've got chains in the base, a chain to work up into the next row, and now we've got our stitches, which in this case is a double crochet stitch that we've worked into each and every single stitch. And that's how you can find the stitches one next to the other, okay? So now let's talk about this stitch itself. So this is the double crochet stitch. It sits a little taller. So there are several parts to it. So as we've discussed so far, we've got the base, which is right here, and we'll talk about the base in further rows in a second. But in this case, the chain stitch here is the base of this stitch. The post of the stitch is this, what is created here, this long part here, okay? So see how I've got the needle behind there? It's just to push the post forward. So when we talk about stitches using front post techniques, that's a stitch that will help push the post of your stitch forward. Just like when we talk about back post techniques, it's stitches that we use to push the post back. So you can see if I've woven that needle in from behind and across the front, it's now pushing that post to the back. So later on we talk about back post post stitches, that's what they're talking about, okay? So in any case, if I continue to just weave in and out here, you can see how this stitch, this is the post. The middle section is the post of the stitch. And in this case, we're talking about the double crochet, okay? Now, working into the stitch of a double crochet, for example, means that we're working into the top 2 loops. So see how I pulled that apart there? That is the stitch or the working stitch that belongs to this entire stitch. I know I used that word twice, but this is all one full stitch known as the double crochet, and this top is when we're working into it. This is what we mean when we're working into the stitch. So I'm just pulling that apart there for you. And generally speaking, when I've worked, if I'm working from right to left, the top of the stitch usually sits just in the right corner of that, okay? So this belongs to this post, this belongs to this post. So remember, it's the top 2 loops. So if you look at the top, see how, again, you're creating these? That is your full stitch, okay? Now, if I turn my work, like in many cases, if I'm working in rows, which is different than working in rounds, and I turn my work, when I work into the stitch, see that stitch now in the back, what side does it sit on? It sits just slightly to the left of the top part of the post, okay? So can you see that? So if I pull the work apart, you see the top of the stitch or into the stitch is now sitting to the left, and that's because I've turned my work over. So let's talk about moving on to subsequent rows. So in this example, we're using the double crochet. So again, what we need to do is chain 3. Remember, we need to create the height, okay? So we chain 3, and then this loop here, the last stitch here, so this post, that loop here, that's the base of that stitch. So if I turn my work and I'm getting ready to now double crochet across, sometimes people will open up the work and go, oh, okay, I see, there's a stitch right there, which is very true. But if I were to work into this stitch, what I've now done is something called an increase. And an increase is when you create more than one stitch because of working into the same stitch. So usually an increase is 2. So this stitch has now produced 2 stitches. So you see that? So we've got 1 and 2. Now we don't want that if we want the sides of our work to remain nice and straight. So that is why we don't work into that stitch usually, and that is known as the base. So see this first one here? This is known as the base of this chain 3. So if you want to think of it like this, a double crochet consists of really 4 chains. If you were to break it down really clearly through the count, we've got chain of 3 plus the base here. Just like here, we had chain 3 and then 1 chain at the base when we first did that. Okay. Now, some people only use a chain 2 to create the height, so then their 3rd chain would be the base or the bottom of that stitch. So if the word base is throwing you off, that's the bottom of this stitch. So now we've created the height. So now we continue working on our double crochets in this case. So I'm not going to work into the bottom of this set here. I'm going to go into the very next one. So remember, on the back of the work, our stitches are now sitting just slightly to the left of our post. So you see that? This is a post. That stitch belongs here. We need to work onto the next post. So I'll yarn over and I'll insert, pull through, and pull through 2, and pull through 2 again, okay? And I know you're thinking, wow, that's kind of really loosey-goosey there. But as you work more rows, this will straighten out, which you hear me say a lot. So if I do a few more double crochets, so now Once you've established row 1, it does become easier to find your stitches. So you see that, the very next one. So the next stitch would be this one here. So you can see it's the next one sitting beside the one you have just worked. Okay, so see, that was it. This is the next one. So the one next to this is this one here. Okay, so I work that again and double crochet. And into the next one is right here. So hopefully now you can see how they're sitting, okay? And of course you'll always be just a little slightly off, but because of where the top of the stitch sits. But then as you work subsequent rows, it always evens out. As long as you have the same number of stitches each and every time in your rows, you'll always have nice uniform work. And again, just taking you to the end of this row here, which is your second row. So I can see my next stitch is right here. So I'm going to work my double crochet as usual. But you can probably see that I'm now coming up to a chain, because see how this stitch is a bit more rounded out. So we always work into the top of the posts. You see that? So the post was here and the stitch was sitting on top. So because we have a chain 3, so if I turn that over, so you can see that's where we did our very first chain 3. We want to find the top of the chain 3. So there it is right there. So if I can't quite see it from the back, sometimes I'll just turn it to face the front of that stitch where I can find it and then identify it. So it's right there. And then I turn my work back there and then I'll insert, I'll yarn over and I'll insert right into where that top is. And I try to get at least 2 loops. And so loops just means the number of threads on your hook. Yeah, just like that. I like doing that just because it makes it feel like the work is more solidified there. So I'm just going to pull through and then resolve my double crochet as usual. Usually at the ends of rows, I try not to make the stitch too tight because a common thing that happens is the ends get bunched and then your work starts to look scrunched up. So now you should be able to see, there we go, how it sits nicely. So we found the top of our chain 3. Sometimes people think, well, I'll just work into this space that's provided here. But when you do that, it creates a bump out and we don't want that there, okay? So you always work into the top of your chain 3 or chain 2 or chain 1. In this case, it's chain 3. Now, different patterns will call for different techniques depending on the look or the texture that you're looking to create. But if you want to just practice good basic stitching techniques, this is the way to begin. Okay, so really focus on making nice, even, uniform work, not stitching too tightly, being a little bit relaxed, keeping things nice and even. So I hope that this all has helped a little bit more in diving into looking at parts of your stitch. So in this case, we've talked about how to identify parts of your stitch when you are working on flat, squarish projects or projects that sit flat. So we've talked about what the chain stitch looks like and how to count the chains using the little ridges here. We've talked about the fact that each stitch has a base or a bottom end to it. So your first row has the chains as the base or the bottom of the stitch. Each of these particular stitches has a post. So again, double crochets are a little easier to see because they're taller. So there's a post here. And if I go to this one, it's the post here. And each stitch has a top to it, which is usually when we talk about working into a stitch, this is what we're talking about. So if I just turn this so you can see the top of the stitch, it also has a V formation here. And since I'm here, I'll just discuss what these 2 loops represent. So if I have my work facing me here, so I've just finished a row, these loops, or this is the top part of this stitch, The loop that's closest to me when I look at it, this is considered the front loop. So some projects will have you working into the front loops only. So for example, let me just turn my work here. So I'm going to just chain 1 this time. I'm going to use a single crochet for this example. So this is going into the full stitch, you see, and you'll know because you've got 2 loops on the top of your hook. Sometimes a project will ask you to work into the front loop only. So instead of going all the way to the end, you go under that first loop. So see how it's coming up through there? So if I'm using a single crochet in this case, I'm just going to pull through and resolve this single crochet, but I only went into the front loop. Okay, so the back loop gets left behind. So if I did a few of these, this is the front loop again, and then the stitch beside it, you can see this one's been worked into, is right here, but I don't go all the way to the back. I try to come up through the center there, and that is the front loop. It's the loop closest to that faces you. So if I turn my work here, you see what that does? It pushed the back loop out and it creates this really neat ridge or ribbing effect. So again, basic stitches, but it's how you work into them that can change the look and give some neat texture to it. So if you ever hear people talking about working into the front loops, it's always the loop that's closest to you facing it. So for example, if I'm looking at my work here, the front loops are now this, because this is the loop facing me, but because my work is going this way, my front loops are here. Now, sometimes they will say work into the back loops only. So if the front loop is the one that's closest to you, the back loop is the one furthest away. So again, if I turn my work, this is the front loop. This is the back loop here. Okay, so if I worked into that back loop, like in this example, I'm just going to use a single crochet again. You see? So I'm going down the center of the stitch and pushing that back one out. So I'm working the stitches into the back loops only. So again, you can tell this one's the one that's been worked because it's stretched out. The one right beside it is right there. And I work the single crochet. So, and again, it's just another way to create a ribbing effect there. Okay, so front loops and back loops. Each stitch has 2 loops at the top of it. The front is the one closest to you. The back is the one furthest away from you. Okay, and I'm just going to finish this here. So I'm just using in my 3rd round here, or row, I should say. Row is different than rounds, and I'm going to explain that right now. I'm just using single crochets in this one. And again, because this had chains, 3 chains here, I want to find the top one, and now I can see it quite clearly. It's there. I'm going to work into the top of that, not into the space. See, if I work into the space, it creates a bump here. And we want our work to, for the most part, be quite smooth and uniform. So I always work into the top of the chain 3 or chain 2, whatever the previous stitch was. Okay, so this is working on a flat project, but let's